Well, if there's nothing further on that, the final matter I wanted to raise is electoral fraud. And this has constitutional aspects, which I'll come to in a moment. In the 80s, legislation was changed about elections on the basis of that it should be easier for people to vote. Some people said, well, they didn't know it was hard to vote, but a number of things were changed. For example, they got rid of subdivisional voting. And I thought the great advantage of subdivisional voting was that people were more likely to know you in that area than if you voted at large in your electorate. The next, I'll just ask a number of questions which you may comment on. Why is no proof of identity required? When I went to the post office the other day to collect a parcel, I had to produce my driver's license, but I don't have to when I vote. And one thing I just do not understand is why is the roll not linked electronically? When you go and you vote, why isn't it ruled off electronically so it's ruled off right across the Commonwealth rather than ruled off with a pencil? They say it's the expense of doing that, I gather. The next point is why are the rolls no longer accessible? Once upon a time you could go and check on the rolls, and the great advantage was people would go around on behalf of the parties or interests. They would go to each house and try and check how many people were living there, so that people would be sometimes surprised that there were 3 or 4 people living in the house whom they'd never heard of, who somehow got registered at that address. Now it's impossible to do that. It's said to be because of privacy. Well, if it is privacy, why can the politicians have access to the rolls but the people can't? The next one is, why is it so easy to enroll? In this plebiscite, almost 100,000 additional names came on to the roll. There's no possibility of checking on those. They might claim that they have a driver's license. They won't check on those licenses. Or you can sign it in front of another voter. Who's to know who the other voter is? So it is very easy to get onto the rolls. Which brings me to the next point, which had the High Court involved. John Howard introduced legislation to close the rolls on the day the election is called. And the reason being is that it was suspected that the vast number of sudden enrolments that were lodged at the Electoral Commission were fraudulent, and that they would only be picked up months later when letters were written to them. That was challenged in what is called the Get-Up case, because Get-Up found 2 people who had reason to complain. One was a person who quite delinquently hadn't registered. I think it was a girl. Everybody had been talking about an election soon. Ms. Gillard had threatened an election. The election didn't take place until then. They all knew an election was coming. Another person didn't bother to change their address in time for this. They then complained to the High Court that they were disadvantaged. They could have done what they needed to do beforehand. They complained to the High Court. The High Court extraordinarily gave a rushed hearing and handed down a decision which said that it was unconstitutional for the Parliament to legislate to close the rolls on the same day the election is called, that this was unconstitutional because the Parliament is directly elected by the people. This means that there must be a reasonable chance to get onto the rolls or to be able to vote, and they thought this was unreasonable. The High Court seemed to be guided, I thought, by the evidence of the Electoral Commissioner, who said that there would be no problem in checking the integrity of the people who came onto the rolls. It wouldn't upset the integrity of the system. Consequently, as a result of that decision, rushed by the High Court, they rushed a hearing, and they handed down a decision just before the 2010 election. They waited until months before they actually released their judgments, which were released just before Christmas when you happen to be looking at High Court judgments. And 100,000 extra names went onto the roll, and Get Up said that in the election, which was a hung parliament, which just saved the Gillard government, GetUp said, we did that. Because they said we got people into the right marginal electorates, and that is how the Gillard government achieved a hung parliament. What do you think of that? And I had another question. And why aren't the lax rules about voting early enforced? They seem to suggest that we have a right to vote early. I would have thought that the ideal thing is that the nation vote on one day. Vote on one day of the year. Everybody votes on that day, unless you have very good reasons to vote on that day. So there are a number of questions that's open for discussion.
Don't the Greens allegedly say vote early, vote often?
I would comment on the part about the electronic element. I have no doubt that the technology is already available to facilitate electronic voting. And I believe that it could probably be done in a way that is secure and which would be relatively simple. Now, the flip side, which I tend to think is more important than the ability to be a convenient vote, is the idea that everybody goes out and does something together on the same day. And I think there's something desirable about that. It's the least, I think, that people can commit to a democracy to actually physically turn up and to do that, and probably will encourage them to put more thought into that process. That said, I think it's very different with the electronic roll.
Yes.
I think that is absolutely fundamental. That I cannot understand why that has not already been implemented. And there's no doubt that the technology is available extremely cheaply, I would expect. And to also produce some basic form of identification like a driver's license to do so. And if you don't have a driver's license, there's many other forms of photo identification which I think would be acceptable also. But that to me is a fundamental responsibility in a democracy.
Damien.
I think there's something to what you say about, people should have to go front up to do it for the sake of the act. The significance of the act of actually going. But just something I heard was they were looking at in Parliament, they you could introduce electronic voting, and there was some discussion that they could abolish the need for the lobbies, that you didn't need to go, divide. You didn't have to have a formal division anymore because you could just press your button, your buzzer. And the parliamentarians were against that, and they thought this tradition, for some reason they still thought a tradition was important, But there's something too, I think, that they could even see that it did actually matter. This act of physically going in one side or the other was an important thing. And, there's something to that you can't, in a world that's becoming more and more digital, those acts are important. So I agree about that, yeah.
The other thing which people have that you couldn't really replicate digitally, Nella would know this with her campaign recently, you have the people handing out information, the volunteers giving out the flyers. Now, there are people who probably haven't, despite the fact that I think that's probably unhealthy, not given too much consideration prior to turning up at the polling booth. So if you're going to have compulsory voting, which that's another question entirely, then that's probably not a bad thing for them to meet someone representing the party that they're going to give their vote to, and someone has the opportunity to then explain what are the policies that their candidate stands for, and I think that just gives a more informed vote.
In ancient times, we used to go and vote at the place for our district, which was near our home, which is known where it is. And then you had no trouble about double voting because there was one list and you went and you were ticked off and you went home and had a cup of tea. There was no chance of going to 3 or 4 places. You had your place, and it's not too hard to go to a place near your place or else arrange a postal vote or whatever's needed, and it seemed to work very well.
Subdivisional voting, yes. Incidentally, just on that question of postal voting, in Switzerland, the Swiss, which practice direct democracy, extraordinary degree of direct democracy, which I found very fascinating. Every 3 months, the Swiss are told what are the the referendums, citizens can, if they have sufficient numbers, petition for a referendum. And this can be in local matters, in cantons, in the states, or federally, and that's done in relation to the Constitution. They do it every 3 months, and you can vote by actually going to the polling booth, but you can also vote by post. And the Swiss know where you live because you have an obligation if you move within so many days to advise the authorities. I think that these seem to be reasonably secure, the lists of addresses, not like in Australia. And they seem to get by with voting by post without it causing any serious breakdown of the system. And it means that they take a wide number of decisions which we usually leave to the politicians. The most famous being a few years ago when there was a petition to stop the building of minarets, not mosques, but the minaret in a mosque in little idyllic Swiss towns up in the hills and in the valleys and so on. And the establishment wasn't very happy about that one, but it was carried overwhelmingly in Switzerland. But they don't seem to be concerned about the potential for fraud in relation to the postal vote. Also, it's not compulsory, so you get quite a small number, 40 or 50%. It still seems to work very well.
My grandson is at the university learning hacking, and I feel that they can do hacking for any vote that there would be. I just think that's one of the problems we'd have to face, that you can do things, marvellous things with electronic equipment.
I really don't think that we've got compulsory voting. How many times do you hear people say, I'm just going to get my name scrubbed off and that's it? They don't even vote. So I think it's compulsory getting your name scrubbed off and that's it.
Yeah.
No such thing as compulsory voting.
Yes. Are there any other questions or comments? If not, are there... Yes. Yes.
I read in the papers over the last 2 or 3 days with the election in New Zealand that for the first time it was possible to enrol as when you turned up at the polling booth. So I think there's something to be said for enrolling somewhat earlier. Yeah, I think there's I think one thing amongst younger people, and I saw this with my brother a few years ago, that he didn't he didn't enrol to vote as soon as he turned 18. He waited some years, and then he was motivated by one or other election. He said he didn't want to see someone elected or someone returned, I think, whatever it was, but he was motivated to enrol then. Whereas I think we would desire that once somebody turns 18, that part of attaining that majority is taking your civic responsibility seriously, as well as other things. So I think that's, when I read that about the New Zealand being able to enrol, it's a bit like when you go to one of those shops and they say, oh well, you know, you can get a 10% discount if you join up with our loyalty program. So you sign up and get 10% on your shopping that day, whether you're going to turn up to that shop ever again. It just seemed to cheapen it in my view.
Well, there's the media, of course, and getting good information to the voter.
Yes, yes. Oh, well, we do need informed voting, don't we?
We need civics in schools.
Need more taught in schools. Yes. Yes. Are there... I think we've reached the end of this subject. I've just put up the rules about voting early. They don't seem to be enforced. There are conditions on voting early, but they seem to encourage people to vote early, and the number is increasing. And some experts say this increases the amount of, or the potential for fraud. Well, we've reached the end of the topics. Are there any other constitutional issues you would wish to raise before we have a break before Tony Abbott arrives?
I'm not trying to be a nuisance. I remember ringing up the electoral people and saying...
The microphone is coming.
Thank you. this came up in our branch to query how many mistakes there were. In other words, how many people had voted twice or whatever. And I rang the authorities. Oh, there's nothing, there's only a couple, And when it came out, there were hundreds that were different. As you know, the people who were elected, let's try again on the list. There was a huge discrepancy. Now, you might have 35 votes deciding an election, and if you've got about 300 or 400 that were illegal, it seemed important. But they don't pursue it, they don't follow it up, and it's not made a big problem.
That raises the issue of the present plebiscite or survey. As you know, you receive your form. It has a barcode on it. This is the only identification, because you don't put it in an envelope with something outside identifying you as a voter. You just put that in an envelope. Now, when that is received by the ABS, what happens if there are a number with the same barcode? People have copied this. It would be easy to copy the form you receive and distribute them or fill them in yourself and then post them off to them. Now, what do? Do they read every barcode with a machine and reject those where there are multiple ones? If they reject ones where there are multiple ones, which one do they say is genuine and which one is fraudulent? I don't think they could say that. So there seems to be, in my humble opinion, a particular weakness there. And of course, the other weakness is in the electoral roll. It is far too easy to get onto the roll. Much easier than, say, opening a bank account, as you know.
100 points.
Yes, you've got to show, and I would think that if the politicians were genuine and really wanted to get rid of electoral fraud, that they would require some form of identity. For example, they could post us all a barcoded form, which you take back to them, or we could show our driving licenses. Our names should be struck off electronically, surely, and I can't see what is wrong with closing the rolls on the same day to prevent people enrolling in that period when the Electoral Commission can't possibly verify them. But that's all I think I would like to say about this. And as I say, are there any other constitutional issues you wish to raise? Yes.
Could I please ask the panel, can you hear me through that? No? A bit high. Is that better? Yes. Could I ask the panel what they think about the raising of the Aboriginal flag, which, if you've noticed, in Melbourne flies over Parliament House, the MCG, every police station, many town halls, and I don't think it's quite the same in Sydney. Would you like to comment?
Well, it is the same in Sydney, I'm afraid. Yes, and it varies with Labor governments. Some Labor governments, especially the Bob Carr government, made it mandatory for all public buildings that were in their sort of bailiwick to do that. But also, when Rudd Gillard were in office, the Commonwealth made it mandatory, not just for raising the flag, but that every meeting of the every public meeting of a Commonwealth instrumentality had to follow the Indigenous protocol. Now that happened. In pretty well all cases, it meant that they had to have a welcome to country. Welcome to country is a phony, entirely phony ceremony, and there's good evidence from people who actually grew up in traditional societies. The best person is Bess Price, who's very well known these days, and she says we never did that in traditional country. It's a new thing. It's an invented tradition, a recently invented tradition. I use the word tradition in inverted commas because, and we have other things. The best one we've had, or the funniest one we've had articles on in Quadrant, is about the CSIRO, because under Gillard there was this big push on all Commonwealth instrumentalities, not just the public service, but anyone who's funded by the Commonwealth, to have an Indigenous protocol. And the CSIRO instituted a protocol for new buildings that, or new premises anyway, they just rented them. If they had new premises, they had to have a particular form of ritual that preceded them occupying it. And the ritual was a smoking ceremony. And the smoking ceremony would, if you went through the fine detail of the protocol, said that this is to ward off evil spirits. Now, the concept of evil spirits comes from Hollywood movies. The Indians were supposed to have, the Tonto always told the Lone Ranger that there were evil spirits around. It's not evil spirits is a ridiculous concept, but the idea that a scientific organisation not only endorses but spends good money on evil spirits, it should be laughable in scientific circles. But the only place where this story ever got a running was in Quadrant magazine. The daily newspapers, we thought they would jump at this, but they didn't want to know about it. They are terrified of insulting any of the identity groups, no matter how bizarre the identity group's behaviour is. And the Aboriginal flag is also a recently devised thing. It emerged out of the Aboriginal Tent Embassy in Canberra. And which was a Communist Party funded movement. The first Tent Embassy was funded by the Australian Communist Party and by unions associated with it, and it's essentially it's supposed to be inclusive and unifying, but in my view, it's a divisive. It says there's not one people, there's not one community who are Australians. There are at least two, and now we have a lot of public buildings, hangover from the Gillard era, have the Torres Strait Islander flag. This is supposed to be a nation as well. Now, if you look at the demography of the Torres Strait Islands, what you find is that there are about 100,000 people in Australia at the moment who are descended from the Torres Strait Islanders, but only about 3,500 of them actually live in the Torres Strait Islands. The rest about half of them, the rest live in Townsville and Cairns, and the other half are distributed right throughout the whole of Australia. So we've got a situation where about 5 or 6% of the Torres Strait Islanders, who are supposed to be a nation represented by their flag, there's only 5 or 6% of them who want to live there. And the minute that any kid who's born there, has got enough money for the ferry fare to get out of there, they get out of there. It's a bit like Tasmania, another basket case. So this is the idea that the Torres Strait Islanders have a nation is laughable, and there should not be a flag, and no one should be forced to fly it.
I think I might just make one small correction there. I don't think the Torres Strait Islander flag is left over from Gillard, because it was proclaimed by General Jeffrey when he was Governor General. So I think it was Howard. If not Howard, it was Rudd. But it wasn't Gillard. But look, I guess what I would say about these flags is these flags have been proclaimed by the Governor General. They're recognised under the Flags Act. My feeling is I'd rather see the Queen's portrait displayed more regularly. I think that would be a good thing. And, if the Queen's portrait were being displayed regularly, and if the national flag were being displayed, and if the Aboriginal flag and the Torres Strait Islander flags were also being displayed, I wouldn't think that was the end of the world, because, if people saw the embodiment of the monarch there, if they saw that these things are compatible, I think that'd be a good thing. I'm more disappointed personally to see the way the symbols of the monarchy have disappeared. And if we took a little bit more interest in our public symbols and the importance of them, and if that meant in schools displaying those flags as well as displaying a picture of the Queen, I'd rather see that than see none of it displayed. I don't see it as being a terrible thing that those flags are displayed. But you know, as I say, I'd rather focus on saying, you know, we should also be displaying the picture of the Queen.
Well, I'm very disappointed that the Welsh and Hungarian flags are not displayed more prominently for all Welsh Hungarians in Australia.
And look, as a descendant of Welsh, English, Irish people, and someone from Saxony before it became German, I'd like to see all my flags. I mean, in Australia, it's just absurd because you can't separate our mongrel backgrounds. And as for having the portrait of the Queen everywhere, I couldn't disagree more, and I don't especially want to offend people at the Australians for constitutional monarchy, because I am a constitutionalist. I support the existing system 100%. But I think one of the big mistakes that Tony Abbott made as Prime Minister, it was a silly thing, as a lot of people said, but was to give Prince Philip an extra award, extra gong on Australia Day. If he'd done it on Christmas Day or Queen's birthday, it would have made nothing at all. But what a lot of politicians and a lot of people don't realise is how much in the suburbs and in country towns Australia Day has become a symbol of patriotism, in fact, and nationalism. And it's a very popular day, and it's a good feeling holiday. It's almost the last day of well, certainly the last day of the school holidays. And if you go to, I sort of have, our families have holiday houses in the Blue Mountains and up the Central Coast. And if you go to these places on Australia Day, you find there are entertainments, there's music, there's markets. It's turned into a popular cultural phenomenon. Most of the mass media don't pick it up. At Pearl Beach, where my two grandchildren go, they have races for the children, and all the kids wear Australia flags as singlets, and they're proud to be Aussies, and it's a terrific popular sentiment. And it's our day, it's Australia Day. And when Tony Abbott gave a gong to Prince Philip, he really showed he didn't understand that. And don't underestimate the popularity of Australian nationalism and Australian patriotism, because it's the best argument Conservatives have got going for them today.
Yes, David, thank you. As President of the Australian National Flag Association Victoria, I can only say we only have one flag.
Just as long as we never see an IS flag.
No other comments? Yes.
I think Prince Philip's done so much for Australia. Well, I think Prince Philip has done so much for the whole Commonwealth and Australia with his Prince's Awards and the Duke of Edinburgh Awards and so on. And he's shown a great interest in Australia, and I think it was a great thing that he got the award, and I think it doesn't matter when he got it.
Well, my view is the award's okay, it was the wrong day.
Well, my feeling is that Tony Abbott also made a mistake in making them too exclusive. He should have given so many to, outstanding sports people and actors and actresses and all sorts of people, and that would have made it much more difficult to remove, as in New Zealand.
You've just got me.
Could have given a few round here, I think, don't you think?
You've just mentioned New Zealand. You've just mentioned New Zealand, David, and I've got to take my hat off to Winston Peters from the New Zealand First Party, who wants to buy back all state-owned assets. Power being the first, and also he doesn't want to tax farmers for water, so good on you, Winston.
Is that so, Winston? Good. Yes.
I think it's a disappointing thing that when the Queen doesn't receive gifts, or seems not to receive gifts from the Australian government or the state governments on the significant occasions of her reign or her life. That was always a practice, and that seems to not to have been observed. One of the things which the Queen seems to be proudest of is the wattle brooch that she received from the Government of Australia. Was it on the occasion of her visit or her coronation? She's very proud of that and always remembers to bring it with her when she makes a visit here. But we seem to be ungenerous or ungrateful in that we don't. She celebrated very significant anniversaries in recent years, and there seems to have been nothing, very little acknowledgement, or not even a gift from the Australian government or the state governments to whom she's given tremendous and wise service.
I saw a list of gifts to Her Majesty on one occasion. I think it was for her wedding when she was a princess, and one was from the Queensland government. And it was a vast number of cans of tinned pineapple. It was a curious gift. Yes, yes. Are there any further comments or questions? Yes, Brian.
Yeah, I agree with the gentleman in front of me. Well, each state, we've got two flags, our national flag and our state flags. And when we all went to school, we used to swear allegiance to the flag and the country, sing the national anthem, and each morning after assembly and after each break through the day, for recess and lunch, we used to have to march back into our classrooms, and that gave everybody pride in who they are and where we are, and I think that's got to come back again too.
You hear it now? Well, Malcolm and I still help with the Joeys and the Cubs in the Scouts at home. Joeys are aged from 6 till 8 and Cubs are 8 till 11. And I'm in charge of them. They do a prayer each week. One cub does it, and then they do a picture and write a prayer and bring it the next week, and we stand around the Scout badge, which is on the floor, and do it. And we have God, Queen, Country every week for those Cubs and Joeys. They really know it all, and we sing God Save the Queen, and they know the words. And we've kept that going in our Scout movement.
Very good. They've just...
Hello? Yep. Unfortunately, the Girl Guides, I understand, removed it, but it's great that the Scouts have retained that.
But Yarrawonga, they still have
The local councils
your microphone's coming.
I'm sorry, thank you. The local councils are right out of hand, I think. I think they've got no clear direction or that they accept about where their responsibilities end.
You seem to have some radical councils in Victoria.
But that's sort of a contribution to your discussion.
Thank you. Well, we're shortly going to receive the 28th Prime Minister, Tony Abbott. So shall we break for a little while and come back out? Would you join with me in thanking the panel?